If someone came to you and criticized your faith and said, you Christians pick and choose which parts of the Bible that you want to follow, and you totally ignore the other parts, what would you say? The real question is this: how do I, as a Bible reader, determine which parts specifically of the Old Testament are still valid and still apply to my life today? That's coming up today. Hey, my friend, welcome to The Beat. My name is Alan Parr. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time here, it's a pleasure. If you enjoy this video, consider subscribing and hit that little bell notification so you won't miss a beat. So in this video, I want to give you just two things to consider, two questions to ask yourself as you are determining whether or not what you're reading still applies today. And real quick, if you have any specific questions about some of the rules and laws in the Old Testament that you're not sure whether they apply today, leave that in the comments section below. The first question that you want to ask yourself is there something in the New Testament that confirms what was written in the Old Testament? So as you're reading through the Old Testament, maybe you're reading the book of Leviticus and you're saying, hey, does this really apply today? If you can find that same command in the New Testament repeated, then that means that it still applies to us today. But speaking more generally in terms of the value of the Old Testament, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 says this: all scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. So right there, it lets us know that as a Christian, you cannot just simply read the New Testament and say, hey, I don't need to read the Old Testament because nothing in the Old Testament is useful for me today. This scripture, which by the way was written before the entire New Testament was finished, confirms that there is value in reading and studying the Old Testament. With that being said, however, Galatians chapter 3, verses 24 and 25 says this: therefore, the law, speaking of the Old Testament, was our tutor to bring us to Christ that we might be justified by faith. Now here it is. But after faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. It says that the Old Testament was there to lead us and to help us better understand what Jesus Christ was going to do whenever he came. And so whenever he came, we are now therefore no longer under the law in the same way that they were in the Old Testament. I actually have another entire video giving you 7 reasons why every Christian should read the Old Testament. I'll put a link to that in the description box below. But secondly, the real question you want to ask yourself is this: which part of the Old Testament law was this particular command under? You see, the Old Testament Jewish law can be separated or broken up into 3 parts. You have the moral law, then you have the ceremonial laws, and then you have the civil law. The moral law was comprised of things like the covenant of marriage, stealing, lying, killing, cheating, adultery, sexual laws, things like that. And the reason why these laws are still in effect today is because these laws communicate or reflect God's character, and because God's character never changes, therefore these laws will never change, and they will always be in effect whether in the New Testament or the Old Testament. But the second part of the Jewish Old Testament law is what's called the ceremonial law. And this included things like whether your clothes were mildew or not. Yes, they had specific laws for that. A woman being unclean on her monthly cycle, or a man being circumcised, or a leper being considered unclean, or certain foods that you would eat would make you spiritually or ceremonially unclean, or whether you celebrate certain holy days or certain feasts. If you notice, none of the things that I mentioned there have absolutely anything to do with morality, right? Good or bad. It's not making you a better person if you get circumcised or not. It doesn't make you a more moral person if you eat steak or if you do not. It doesn't make you immoral if you're a woman and you are on your monthly cycle. So this is the reason why these things changed when Jesus Christ came, because it has nothing to do with morality. They were under what was called the ceremonial law, which, by the way, was given to a nation of people for a specific time. So notice I said it was given to a specific group of people, the nation of Israel, for a specific time. time. All of these laws were simply established to train God's holy people, the nation of Israel, in the ways of holiness as they came out of the pagan Egyptian culture in which they were enslaved. And the third part of the law that we're not going to spend much time in it is the civil law, and that's just simply a group of laws that help keep the nation running smoothly and included all of the penalties that you would incur if you were guilty of breaking the moral law. The best way that I could explain this is think about the moral law as being the United States law, and then think about the ceremonial and the civil laws being a state law. And so if you are living anywhere in the United States at any time, well then you must adhere and obey to the US law. So since I live in Texas, if I travel outside of Texas, I am no longer limited or bound by the laws in Texas, but I still am under the US law. In the same way, no matter what time frame and period that you live in, we will always be accountable and have to obey and be subject to God's moral law. But because we do not live in the Old Testament time frame anymore, and also that we are not the nation of Israel, the specific ceremonial and civil laws do not apply to us today. If you found this video helpful in any way, feel free to share it with a friend. Also, if you haven't done so already, I would love it if you would subscribe. Check out some of the other videos on this channel while you're here. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time on The Beat.